Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Shock Army of Acontecimento. In this, as with other faction focus videos, we'll be talking through who the Shock Army are, how they play, what some of their strengths and identifying features are, as well as some of their limitations, before jumping into Infinity Army and diving into not all but many of the profiles that exemplify them and make the faction who they are. As always, thanks for the channel supporters who make videos like this possible. This video comes at request of channel member Ethan Thornton, who requested a Shock Army faction focus. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member, thanks to everyone who has. Now, I have been playing Shock Army almost for as long as I've been playing Infinity. They were the second faction that I picked up after jumping into Pan-Oceania with the Neo-Terran Capitoline army, and it was actually Shock Army that I took to my very first satellite event, which was CanCon, and I couldn't even tell you what year that was. I have a long and deep fondness for them, and I think today, in 2024, they kind of stand as a bit of an example of what classic Pan-Oceania really is. Now, this is in part because they are probably the least modernized sectoral for Pan-Oceania. If we look at Neoterra and Varuna, for example, particularly since the Fire Team rework, those two factions have had proportionally more, actually significantly more, added to them, changes that have brought them more up to speed with what I would call modern N4 and how N4 plays, whereas the Shock Army have not. But in the case of the Shock Army, the bones that are there are so solid and have held in place for so long, they represent a formula that never really went out of style and is still consistently strong and powerful. If you want to play classic Pan-Oceania, which is a light infantry core link team that performs well above the points you pay for it, plus heavy firepower pieces, which open the way for you then to go and accomplish the mission, that is how Acontecimento plays. They want to play the high and the low end of the game, tags and light infantry, and then sprinkle just a selection of expensive medium weight pieces in the middle to go and do the mission and cross the table and spend all the orders that your light infantry are generating. Acontecimento regulars are going to be the first unit that we talk about when we jump into Infinity Army, and that is for good reason. There are not many line troop units that have the same variety of profiles and the same general applicability as Acontecimento regulars are, and realistically it's only basically Gulam infantry and Hak-Islam that have the same breadth of actually useful, non-gimmick profiles to give them a serious and wide, like you can build multiple fire teams of Acontecimento regulars and have that actually be the base of an army. You can absolutely take Fusilier fire teams in other Pan-Oceanian sectorals, but they don't function the same way that Acontecimento do, actually serving as a kind of polyvalent do-everything unit if you need them to. Couple that with the superlatively powerful tags, and again, Shock Army of Acontecimento has some of the absolute creme de la creme of Pan-Oceania, with a serviceable and competent middleweight category, and you have just a very solid faction that is doing the things that Pan-Oceania has historically done. This consistency also tends to manifest in a few other ways as well, and if you are looking for, I would say, particularly unique strengths, I would note that the Shock Army of Acontecimento are capable of building what I would call one of the most shit table resistant armies in the game. There was a reason I took them to my first major Infinity event. I wasn't sure what I'd be playing against, I wasn't sure what kind of tables I would run into, and the thing about the Shock Army is that they have access to the cheapest and only core linkable with full composition bonus sappers in the game. Couple that with a surprisingly solid midfield, mobility, and good tags, which can be relatively easily deployed, particularly in the case of the Tikbalang, and plentiful deployment zone mine layers, often at 0 SWC cost, or effectively 0 SWC cost, and you have a faction that can almost always deploy comfortably, even on tables that look like they just weren't set up with Infinity in mind. And we have all seen those. As much as Infinity tournament organizers will always do their absolute best to make sure that every table and an event is fun and playable and excellent. When you are setting up large numbers of tables, 20 tables, 50 tables for really big events, things slip through the cracks. And yes, players can bring that to the attention of tournament organizers and have them corrected, etc., etc. But if you are playing the Shock Army of Acontecimento, you can genuinely set up and perform on tables like that. And just to give a personal anecdotal example, I have played at least one tournament game with the Shock Army of Acontecimento where I had, and I'm not kidding, pretty much just two pieces of terrain in my entire deployment zone, and I was still just about able to deploy my entire army in a manner that had functional AROs and where the squishy elements was protected, and I was able to build a cohesive defense despite the fact that the deployment zones were the most unplayably abominable I have ever seen before or since. Now, spoiler alert, I didn't win that game, but the loss was not off the back of the inability of Acontecimento to deploy. The loss was off the back of the fact that my opponent, engaging at bad range through a saturation zone, crit me 12 times in the first round. And you know what? There are some things that any Pan-Oceanian player has to accept will happen to them occasionally, and for me, it was that game where I Pano lost the game. It's a thing, and you just have to deal with it as Pan-Oceania. You can get locked out by sheer bad luck. You don't have smoke, and in this particular case, I only had so much midfield to try and carry me through. It was a memorable game, to say the least. Now, like most Pan-Oceania, the Acontecimento Shock Army doesn't really have the need or capacity to tailor for specific matchups, and it does not need to tailor for tables, which means that it can and should typically tailor for missions. Among Pan-Oceanian factions, that's something that it's actually quite good at doing, and Shock Army in particular has a really nice mix of specialist choices that can be fairly comfortably inserted into list. Whether the mission calls for engineers or paramedics or hackers, the Shock Army can fit them into lists relatively comfortably, including as part of links, including mobile links if you're so inclined. And when you do take them, they tend to have higher than average Pan-Oceanian whip. With the exception of your engineer, which is going to be whip 12, everything else is going to be whip 13 or even whip 14, which particularly when you take specialist bonuses in the mission into account really is a luxury for Pan-Oceania. Now, in terms of limitations, like much of Pan-Oceania, the Shock Army does need to think about what its answer to the question, or answer to the question of, you've made your enemy keep their heads down, now what actually is. And I would say that the close assault options for the Shock Army of Acontecimento, while they do exist, particularly since the points nerf to the Peacemaker, they are relatively limited. Your close assault options are pretty much always going to be either hackable or expensive or both, which means that in any given game, once an Acontecimento player has suppressed hard enemy AROs, they need to actually genuinely consider, is this a point where I press the assault, or is this a point where I do the mission? And for Pan-Oceania, probably more than a lot of their compatriots for Shock Army, rather than a lot of their compatriots within Pan-Oceania, the answer is sometimes going to be do the mission more than necessarily press the assault. Apart from that, as noted, the biggest limitation of the Shock Army of Acontecimento really is that they are just showing their age a little bit now. The bones of the faction are very, very solid. There's a lot of good things to say about it, a lot of which I've enunciated already. But if you look at the complexity of the fire teams, for example, in Neoterra, particularly since Blades got added to the faction and the different Squallow models began to exist, the Shock Army really does feel like it is playing with a proportionally smaller hand of cards than particularly Neoterra and Varuna. For this reason, generally speaking, my recommendation is Shock Army is a faction for you in one of a few circumstances. Firstly, if you're looking for a relatively constrained learning experience while you're jumping from another faction to Pan-Oceania, the Shock Army of Acontecimento will teach you how to play Pano very well. They'll give you a firm base to learn from that will carry you through games, and you can jump into the more technical aspects of this faction with other factions like Neoterra and Varuna once you've got a grounding. Alternatively, if you are a Pan-Oceanian player with a wide selection of models, and you've played Varuna, and you've played Neoterra, and you've played Svalaheimer, and you want to take a trip down memory lane and remember what Pan-Oceania was like back in the old days, Acontecimento really is kind of a living history record. And I mean that with actual genuine fondness and not as a denigration of the faction. Yes, it is a little dated now. Yes, the fire teams are relatively simple. They are not complex by N3 standards, N4 standards, but the bones of the faction are sufficiently strong, and the playstyle that the faction will teach and require of you works even in 2024 in modern N4 with all of the complexity that all of the different factions have access to. For that reason, they are a very easy proxy if you already have a Pan-Oceanian collection, and can be a very fun kind of army to go back to from time to time or a Pan-Oceanian player, even if they aren't necessarily your main squeeze. Now, with the rundown out of the faction out of the way, let's jump into Infinity Army and start talking profiles, and we are going to start with Acontecimento regulars. These are your light infantry pure fire team core option, and 5 of these will be the basis of many, if not all, of your Shock Army of Acontecimento lists. Just taking a look at the profile first, what we can see is that we have the basic Fusilier kind of setup where they have ballistic skill 12, they gain terrain jungle at no additional cost, and they gain 1 point of willpower at the cost of 1 point of armor. Now, the drop from armor 1 to armor 0 is not going to be meaningful in that many cases. Yes, obviously, statistically, it will matter some of the time, but particularly when we're talking about line infantry, if you're taking heavy damage firepower, that 1 point of armor is something that you may well be willing to make the trade-off in exchange for having, say, higher quality specialists. You actually have credible button pushers and hackers out of your Acontecimento regulars, for example. But the main thing is that they are still that ballistic skill 12, which means that in a core link, they go up to ballistic skill 15. Which makes them the thoroughly credible basis for a fire-based style team around which you can base the rest of your list. 5 of these will generate 5 regular orders, they'll give you a Whip 13 lieutenant, they'll give you 1 or 2 guns and some specialist and a lieutenant and a decoy, and that is the start of many Acontecimento lists. Now, the other thing about Acontecimento regulars is that there is a genuine selection of profiles here which have things that are not just your guns, your forward observer, your paramedic, your hacker, and done. There are profiles in the Acontecimento regulars that you will routinely take in lists which do interesting and different things and actually let you take these guys in numbers without just spamming basic dudes with combi rifles. We're going to talk the guns first, but we will come back to these interesting and varied profiles because they are a big part of why Acontecimento still holds up, despite the fact that it hasn't had significant updates in the fire team space since the fire team update. So, big guns first, there really are only 2 choices here. There are the Spitfire and the multi-sniper rifle. The Spitfire is an occasional option that you will take in Haris teams. You can take them, they're fine. It's one of the very few 1 SWC guns in Shock Army. Most of the time you'll be paying 1.5 SWC for your heavy weapons. The multi-sniper, however, is the primary choice. And the big selling point here, and part of the reason why Shock Army is a faction that can hold up well under crap table circumstances, is because it is a sapper. Sapper is one of the most unique and most interesting and most powerful skills in Infinity, because it gives a model the ability to deploy anywhere and still have cover against fire from all directions, and gain courage and gain mimetism. This means that the core linked Acontecimento Sapper Sniper will deploy anywhere that it wants. It will always have cover, and it will be effectively a ballistic skill 15 mimetism ARO piece. And for a mere 21 points, that is an absolute steal. I often took 2 of these in lists. One is going to be a little bit more sensible in many cases, but 2 of these definitely are playable and give you a tremendous ARO/fire-based option to work with. Now, the downsides of Sapper obviously are that if you move, you lose the benefits of the state, and that does tend to confine your core Link Acontecimento regular unit to fire-based duty. They are more difficult, proportionally speaking, to move out with than units would be that have more active, like, HMG Fusiliers, for example. But if you do need to move them, you still absolutely can. An additional particular synergy to note is that when we are talking about Sapper snipers, do not be afraid to deploy literally on the back table edge. This is usually a part of the table where, like particularly in events, it's going to be less common to see terrain. People don't think about the fact that you can literally deploy touching your back table edge, but Sappers can at no problem whatsoever. And when you have a sniper rifle that is literally as far away from your opponent as it is physically possible to be, you have that much more likelihood of something trying to engage you with, say, a heavy machine gun, and instead having to fight at 33, 34, 35 inches, which really flips the script trying to engage into ARO pieces. When a heavy machine gun all of a sudden is taking -3 range, -3 cover, -3 mimetism for a -9 total, firing into 2 bursts on 15 from the Acontecimento regular, it can be very difficult to dislodge pieces like that. I have had games where I've even managed to outrange missile launchers by deploying as far back as possible, sometimes literally in table corners, because that is a luxury afforded by Sapper. So whatever you do, do not sleep on these. The Sapper Sniper of Acontecimento, whether you are Haris linking them or core linking them, typically you will core link them. Very, very strong and part of the basis of the strength of the faction. However, let's not sleep on everything else that Acontecimento regulars can do, because there is an absolute ton here. There are bells and whistles, but because these are line infantry starting at 10 points, even the bells and whistles profiles are surprisingly affordable, and there's a few in particular that we're going to call out. One is the paramedic. You are taking a core link with, sapper snipers in it. You want to be able to recover them if they go down. You take a paramedic, it's 12 points, and it is a whip 13 specialist, among other things. Because they're whip 13, your lieutenant will almost always be an Acontecimento regular, which immediately means that for relatively low opportunity, or basically no opportunity cost, you have a higher whip than many other Panashinian factions are willing to roll with. Again, it's only by 1 point, but that is nice some of the time. And then I want to call out in particular the hacker and triangulated fire mine layer sensor profiles. Now, that hacker is paying only the 1 SWC that you would usually pay for a hacker, and it frankly is paying pretty much the same amount of points. It's like it's 1 point more than you would expect a hacker in a line infantry unit to be. If we were going to go and look at a Fusilier hacker, for example, we would see that it's 15 points. For only 16 points, the Acontecimento regular hacker, firstly, is whip 13. Secondly, has a fast panda, which would normally be a couple of points just kind of by itself in many cases. And finally, basically at no cost except for the fact that it costs 1 SWC, gets a grenade launcher. And it's a core linkable grenade launcher, and you will almost always have that core link, no less. Which means that if you need to, just basically at no real practical cost to the list, provided you found the points for this hacker in the first place, you just get a spec fire option in there. And there are times and there are places where having access to Ballistic Skill 15 Spec Fire just gives you an out that you otherwise would not have had. So again, 1 SWC in Pan-Oceania, you are not always going to be able to find that SWC, but if you can, that is an absolute hell of a piece to not like win you games all the time, but for just 16 points, when you need it, it tends to come through. Now, second of the two spicy profiles, we have the triangulated fire mine layer shock mines sensor. At just 13 points, this thing gives you a mine being mine laid in your deployment zone, and given that you're playing a Acontecimento, you do not have access to things like Auxilia, your close-in defense is going to be maybe a little lighter than it would otherwise be. Acontecimento makes up for that by just having the ability to turn their deployment zone into a minefield. These things are availability total, they're core linkable, you can just take a couple of them, no problem. You'll also have mine layers in some other profiles in the army, which means that if you really want to, you have the ability to kind of just saturate your DZ with mines when playing as Shock Army. Now, 13 points up from 10 points is an increase, and it means that the model is no longer doing things like acting as a lieutenant decoy, but at relatively low cost, you do still get a tremendous amount of utility. Having sensors in a list is just something that's really, really useful some of the time. And so finding a way to fit just one or maybe two of these into a list can seriously pay dividends. They give you some insurance against things like assassin for days, against warbands trying to make runs on your deployment zone, against basically any impersonator or drop troop. At relatively low cost, they are just nice to have. And in a pinch, these things are not the worst close assault units. If you need something to go after some kind of an enemy link team or model in the midfield, and you have no other option, you can be served worse than by having one of these dudes run up, lay a mine around a corner, and then cross that corner with his ballistic skill 12 combi. It's a little scuffed, but the thing only cost you 13 points, and you were taking it to fill out a link team and lay some mines. And so collectively what this means is that Acontecimento regulars serve not just as the solid basic core around which the rest of your list can be built, but also they cover off on edge cases that you otherwise might not have thought to cover when you are building your like bare bones basic tag and middleweight things and line infantry list. The fact that you get to, with your basic line infantry AVO total, just spread out into some possibility spaces that otherwise you might not have explored is one of the things that makes Acontecimento regulars, next to basically just Gulam infantry, one of the most interesting line infantry profile sets in the game. Now, jumping on from Acontecimento regulars, we have our other primary linkable option, the Bagh-Mari unit. Yes, I know you can also link orcs in the Shock Army of Acontecimento. I am not going to thoroughly recommend that. Orcs are not bad, and that's all I have to say about orcs. Bagh-Mari, however, are interesting. Now, in addition to sharing a little bit of that, oh, hey, there are just a few tools there that I wouldn't otherwise have expected. In particular, the sniper profile just having mines and mine layer at relatively low cost. Bagh-Mari are a solid and utility unit. They're medium infantry veteran troops with MSV1, which means that they can immediately do a ton of classified objectives, and they have the wonderful combination of an MSV level 1 and mimetism. They're only ballistic skill 12, which is serviceable, but when you have MSV1 and Viz mods, the Viz mods are almost always in your favor, so you can absolutely take gunfights. And the points cost for Bagh-Mari, frankly, they are just a little too expensive to really take en masse. You can build a core with these, but I'm hesitant to recommend a 5-person core of ultimately Armor 2 single wound troopers. However, you can cheapen it a little bit with Shock Army of Acontecimento machinists, ultimately not particularly economical. Where I think Bagh-Mari really excel if you're going to take them is as your Haris team option. And that's the point where mixing and matching and giving up on pure fire team bonuses becomes a little more viable, and where you can actually build link teams that are kind of more comfortable moving forward and taking closer engagements. Typically speaking, you'll still want some kind of a gun to be the glue here, and you're going to need one Bagh-Mari to form the link, but you have a few options in terms of your firepower piece. The heavy machine gun Bagh-Mari will, at burst 5, comfortably take face-to-face rolls. It has no problem there. The multi-sniper rifle going up to burst 3 needs to be a little more cautious, but if you take the multi-sniper rifle, you are just getting another deployment zone mine and the ability to move this model into the midfield and place mines that way. Now, any of these other profiles is also potentially an option, but once you've taken your one Bagh-Mari, I actually like to start moving into other pieces in terms of building our Haris team, and there's two ways to do that. The first way is Bagh-Mari can join an Acontecimento Regulars Haris team, so you can have one Bagh-Mari as a more elite big gun in a mobile unit, just supported by regulars, 13 point, 10 point, 12 point regulars, a paramedic, and a mine layer sensor, for example, are able companions to, say, a Bagh-Mari heavy machine gun. You wouldn't put the Bagh-Mari in the 5-person core because then it would no longer have composition bonuses. You'd be stripping it of ballistic skill, but in a 3-person team, that is no issue whatsoever. Alternatively, you can actually move kind of comfortably into a more mechanized approach because bulleteers and machinists can both join Bagh-Mari teams. And so that gives us the option, for example, of if you needed to save SWC or we're doing something with Evo hackers, you could take a Bulleteer Spitfire as your gun, move it up to Ballistic Skill 15 and have an engineer followed around it. You just at that point need a Bagh-Mari in the link team moving along with them. Or you can take a machinist, again, to be your specialist, and a Bulleteer Armbot with heavy shotgun for close assault and doing things like clearing enemy positions once you've suppressed enemy AROs and have made it into the midfield. On screen now, we have the machinist profiles, and the Shock Army Machinist is probably one of the nicest unique machinist profiles, where what it gets for the extra points that you pay for it is Mimetism 3, which means that it's a Ballistic Skill 12 Mimetism 3 model, and that is totally fine. Now, the other reason that I like moving my Haris teams towards Bagh-Mari, Machinist, and Bulleteer is that what you also then have is a mobile element with an engineer in it, which you can use to support your tags. And in Shock Army of Acontecimento, you are often going to be playing a tag. Now, there are only 2 tags in Shock Army of Acontecimento, but if you had to pick only 2, they are absolute doozies. And the first of these is the Tikbalang Armored Chasseurs of Acontecimento. This is the light tag of the 2. It is Armor 6, BTS 6, Structure 3, and Silhouette 6, which means that it's moving around at a relatively small. It's sitting at Structure 6, Silhouette 6, which is usually the sweet spot in terms of ability to vault over and move around terrain and get advantageous line of sight, but not so large as to be difficult to physically deploy on tables that maybe have lower buildings or less high cover. Now, this thing has a ton of tools, including shock mines, which is kind of fascinating on a piece like this. The fact that you can, if you have nothing else to do with it, use the tactical awareness orders and the other orders it may have to do things like lay mines is kind of cool. But ultimately, what this thing is a 6'4" Coming Plus platform with remote presence, Mimetism 3, Ballistic Skill 15, which means that it is an absolute apex gunfighter, particularly with a damage 16 heavy machine gun. Now, do not sweat the fact that this thing does not have armor-piercing ammunition. Yes, once you get to a certain level of armor, trying to punch through that with damage 16 can be a challenge, and that's really at about armor 9 and then, of course, armor 10. If you are fighting literally the Avatar or a Yotum, the tick belang is probably going to come short, but against basically anything else in the game, you can push through a regular tactical armored gear off the combination of the sheer number of hits you are going to land by having higher ballistic skill and mimetism than your opponent, and damage 16 at that point will do the trick. If you are fighting something like a Guija or a Lizard or a Salamander, and you are looking to suppress those pieces, the tick belang is capable of engaging them either to guts back into prone or to their destruction if they choose to try and stay standing. With its speed and climbing plus, and the fact that it is the cheaper of the two tags, the tick belang is a basically superlative all-rounder, mobility, hunter-killer, suppression of enemy ARO, anything that you might want to use a tag for, the tick belang can be used for. It is comfortably just one of the best tags for the price in the entire game. It is a big part of the reason why when I look, for example, at the Clausewitz Ulan, I just think, why can't you be more like your cool brother? And literally the only bad quote unquote thing about the tick belang is that it is so mobile it can sometimes be challenging to actually support with your engineers, because if you aren't disciplined enough to pull it back to a position where you can recover it and repair it, etc., if it becomes damaged, it can just outstrip their ability to support by ending up on a building somewhere in the midfield, looking down into the entire enemy deployment zone and shooting everything that it can see until it finally gets neutralized. The second of our two tags, and the more expensive, although only by about 5 points, is the Dragao Acontecimento Dragoon. And this is, look, there's nothing else to say about this. This is the big gun of big guns. There is one, to my knowledge, Ballistic Skill 15 HRMC in the entire game, and it's this boy. There is absolutely zero wasted space on this entire profile. All you are paying for and all you are getting is a Ballistic Skill 15, Armor 8, BTS 6, Remote Presence, HRMC. It's the only BS15 HRMC, at least that I can think of at short notice. And like, as much as, for example, I love the Nomad Salamander. It is one of my favorite tags. I love it to absolute bits. It always does everything I want it to, but it's Ballistic Skill 14, and the Dragao is Ballistic Skill 15 at basically no additional cost. On top of that, it has the all-important remote presence rule, which is one of the things that significantly differentiates Pan-Oceanian tags from the competition. Yes, Pan-Oceanian tags, like Pan-Oceanian engineers, are only whip 12, but when you can reroll those failed whip rolls, that makes repairing your tags actually a viable option at any point other than after they have fallen unconscious. If you want a tag with an affordable price tag whose roll starts and ends with going BERT to the maximum possible amount that you can go BERT, it is the Dragao Acontecimento Dragoon. No frills, all guns, all bullets, another one of the very best tags in the game, in a faction that is quite able to pay for it and support it, and a defining strength of the Shock Army. Now, you will typically need to choose between one of these two tags, but you don't necessarily have to. It is absolutely possible to run a Shock Army list that is running both a Dragao and a tick belang. It's a little bit of a meme, and it's not the list that we're going to showcase at the end of this faction focus, but it is something to bear in mind that you can do. Mostly off the back of the fact that the Shock Army has Availability 3 7-point Fugazi drone bots, and the Acontecimento regulars being relatively cheap and relatively cheerful, it is possible to build a list that functionally it has the full 15 troops, it has a complete suite of specialists, it can support both of these tags, and it has both of these tags while still having other guns and things that are going on. It won't be a lot of things that are going on otherwise, but you have two of the best tags in the entire game in your list. And that is just, it's a very special thing, and it's a very pan-Oceanian thing. So if you decide to either dabble in Shock Army for a bit, or actually are looking at them as something that you would like to collect, bear in mind that that is something that you may want to consider as a possible future list for when you want to just spice things up a little bit. It is very fun, but it is going to be either borderline horrifically oppressive or something that your opponent genuinely has a solution for, and if they have solved for one tag with, say, their defensive mix, there's a pretty good chance that they've solved for the second as well, and you're not going to be able to afford the pieces that would unpick your opponent's defense if you go all in on two tags. Nevertheless, super cool and very Panoshianian. Now, speaking of the things that you have that will unpick your opponent's midfield, this is where we get into the Shock Army of Acontecimento midfield, and then we'll move on into the independent elements. Now, the Shock Army midfield, I think, used to be one of the major selling points of the faction, and I'm hesitant to say that it is anymore, although it is still eminently serviceable. Now, just to cast our mind back to kind of a trip down memory lane, there was a time when Shock Army really had the holy trinity of midfield operations, which were Dart, Nagas, in particular Naga killer hackers, and Peacemakers. And what that gave you collectively were Peacemakers, which were template attacks, things that could push into enemy lines and were a midfield repeater. Nagas, who were killer hackers, who could go after enemy hackers that might interfere with your Peacemakers. And then Dart, who was a premier skirmisher hunter to go after things that might threaten the Naga, basically giving you in 3, maybe 4 different pieces that could be scattered around the midfield, a very complete tactical suite of options to kind of do anything that you would need to mutually support one another, and unpick the problems that each of them might be faced by. Now, that is an approach that you can still put into a list, but I don't think it functions as well or in the same way, in large part because, firstly, the Peacemaker has become more expensive. It is now a much more fair and reasonable, maybe even slightly overcosted 24 points for the Shotgun Oxbot profile. But then, just more generally, the game has changed around these pieces, and although Dart post pieces on screen right now is still very solid and kind of scary. 34 points for a forward deployment +8 submachine gun is something that you have to be kind of judicious in terms of using, particularly given she is not herself, for example, a specialist operative. She's very good and very cool, and she's a solution to certain problems that you might face, but she's a meta pick now, and because she's a meta pick, that flows on to Nagas, who are themselves, again, expensive for what you get, good, but expensive for what you get, which makes them a meta pick, which makes the entire Shock Army midfield, basically now that Shock Army tags are good enough to play, which has been for all of N4, but we are casting our mind well back here, because Shock Army has maintained its current state basically since N3. Because tags are now good enough to play in pretty much every list, you have to be judicious with your independent elements, and if you are taking the full midfield package, you're probably pushing out some other independent elements. The sacrifices end up being made at that point. Shock Army does not get to have it all. They do have to choose what it is they're taking, and that means being your midfield and independent asset selections, they need to be just a little more considered. Now, if we are taking them, what do we get out of Dart? Well, as mentioned, we get basically one of the best skirmishers in the game. Probably, frankly, the best skirmisher in the game, although you do pay for it. So the total package here is no wound incapacitation, shock immune, mimetism MSV1, ballistic skill 13, climbing plus, and a combination of weapons, really that include the submachine gun, and then your choice of, you get a viral bow, but never mind that, your choice of EM grenades or shock mines. My personal preference here is for the EM grenades because she is Fizz 13, and that is an unexpectedly spicy spec-fire option that you do not need in 9 games out of 10, but having it in that 10th game can be absolutely backbreaking, whereas there are plenty of other options to get shock mines in Shock Army. You don't need them on yet another profile. The EM grenades, by comparison, are genuinely unique. Now, what that means, the basic role of Dart is she can basically get anywhere that she wants, and she can apply that good willpower, MSV1, mimetism, submachine gun engagement to going after and killing other enemy mimetism midfield. There is basically no just generic skirmisher in the game that is good at surviving being hunted by Dart. She wants to move in on them and then set up an out of cover, discover, surprise attack, shoot combination, which typically speaking will force them to reveal an ARO, take the surprise attack, get shot, and get killed. Now, even with the emergence of more elite midfielders, like we see, for example, in Torchlight Brigade, where they have some good but quite expensive midfielders, Dart is typically going to be fighting pieces more expensive than herself, and she's going to be relying on things like the shock immunity, no wound in cap to survive that. But after she's gone and taken out one and made a gap, you can comfortably recamouflage her and then potentially do something with her in a later turn. Don't treat her as expendable. If she's going to do things like go after Masai Morans, for example, which she's very, very good at doing, try and avoid being taken down by the combination of their shotgun and Crazy Koala. You want to go after them in a way where, for example, she doesn't take the shotgun while she's in the process of killing them by using things like Climbing Plus, etc. 34 points for the piece is ultimately expensive, but she does have, it's a relatively narrow, but within that relatively narrow tactical role, she's very, very good at her job. So think about what it is that you need done, and if Dart fits into that niche, then you start opening up the Shock Army midfield. Next up in this list, and we have talked about these already, but we have Nagas, a loner piece from Aleph. Ultimately, look, not horrendously overcosted, but fairly expensive. There are a variety of interesting profiles here, including the Mine Layer, which has a boarding shotgun, 0.5 SWC, 28 points, which gives us a Dogged, Camouflage, Mimetism, Ballistic Skill 12 boarding shotgun with Hate Whip 14. That, however, is more useful on the specialist profiles. If you're not taking the mine layer, you will generally be deviating toward the hackers here, and while yes, they are expensive, the fact that they are whip 14 and under a marker state makes them pretty damn good at their jobs. Having a piece like the Naga Killer Hacker it can gunfight if it needs to with a Ballistic Skill 12 Surprise Attack Mimetism combi, but more importantly, it can do things like go after enemy hackers and attempt to eliminate them with Surprise Attack, Whip 12, and Dogged, which means that if it's doing things like engaging enemy killer hackers, it has a very good chance of securing the kill, even if potentially it goes Dogged in the process. As I mentioned before, if you're taking a Naga, something like Dart is good at complementing its strengths, but we do start getting into a very expensive total package here. You can take two of them. If you do, usually one of them will be a Mine Layer, and then one of them will be something like the Killer Hacker or maybe the Regular Hacker, which gives you plenty of camouflage markers in the midfield. You can even do something like two Nagas and Dart, but we're starting to get into very, very expensive territory at that point. Nevertheless, that does give the Shock Army some degree of obfuscation in its camouflage game, where your opponent will probably have an idea that yes, there is going to be a mine under one of those camouflage markers, but where is the mine? Where is the pieces with the boarding shotgun? Where is the piece with the combi rifle? Where is Dart, etc.? Is going to leave them with at least some fog of war that they have to grapple with. It's definitely a shame that the Shock Army did not get access to Beast Hunters, because Beast Hunters would have been the perfect complement at the cheap, like 15-point end to go along with pieces like Naga and Dart, just to add that fuzziness to the midfield. The fact that you don't have access to Beast Hunters, despite the fact they've been added to many other factions, means that in Shock Army, your opponent knows that if it's not a mine, it is going to be expensive and worth killing, which means that although you have some fog of war in your camouflage markers, you only have so much, and your opponent will still be able to potentially engage with some knowledge into your camouflage markers, knowing what's going on. Finally, therefore, we have the Peacemaker, and the Peacemaker has really been, it's a long-term classic of Pan-Oceanian midfield. Two models with templates, one of which has a repeater, deploying into the midfield. I will love anything with an Oxbot, and the Peacemaker is no exception, but at 24 points for the basic heavy shotgun profile now, again, it is kind of expensive. Don't sleep on these, but if you have some hackers and you have multiple Fugazi in the list, then you at least have the close approaches to your deployment zone taken care of. You don't necessarily need a midfield repeater as much. And at 24 points, you can't necessarily casually include one of these. They do, however, make very good close assault elements if you need to just go into your opponent's deployment zone and hit something like the Fist of God. Going in first with an Oxbot, then with a Peacemaker is guaranteed to make an absolute mess, and with 4 deployment plus 8 and 6-4 movement, they are fast enough to get there efficiently and make those kills. You just need to make sure that your enemy hacking network is suppressed, and if their enemy hackers are hiding back in the DZ behind repeaters, you may find yourself unable to make this kind of assault, which relegates the Peacemaker to a defensive role, where again it is very solid at, but at 24 points it's much more fairly costed and is much less a heavily attractive pace. Now, moving on from our midfield independent elements, we're going to basically just cover the rest of the grab bag of wildcard in the colloquial, not wildcard in the actual, independent element sense that the Shock Army has access to. And we're going to start with the Montesa Order motorized knights. Now, these guys in Shock Army can actually duo with Tick Belangs, which is cool, and it's something that you will consider doing from time to time. But otherwise, they are what I would consider a premier independent operator, where they have 8-6 movement, they are full-on mounted knights, armor 4, BTS 6, mimetism, perfectly serviceable close combat, and a selection of weapons. If you can break these guys through enemy hacking networks, they will absolutely make a mess, particularly, for example, the boarding shotgun profile. So you've got the 27 point, and 27 points is an absolute steal for what you're getting here, or 29 points for the paramedic, which gives you the ability to either, say, emergency recover a Bagh-Mari in our Reese team that's moved into the midfield, or just do objectives, right? Like there are few better pieces in the game for accomplishing supplies as a mission than a motorized order Montesa paramedic. But if you're not accomplishing the mission with these guys, they are, again, provided you can break them through an enemy hacking network, premier close assault. The durability combined with the damage of those weapons and the close combat ability means that if you just get past the fact that they are hackable, they cross the board incredibly quickly and are able to punch through not just one but multiple layers of defense, because at armor 4, especially armor 4 if you've deployed them non-impetuous, with mimetism, they're just perishingly difficult to damage. They can tank through flamethrowers, a chain rifle defense is absolutely no obstacle to them, which means they can absolutely prosecute an offense even on a thoroughly defended position, again, provided you neutralize the hacking network that might stop them. Now, the ways to neutralize a hacking network are to suppress it with shooting, move around it, and again, H6B, they're very capable of doing that. There are a variety of tools, even just down to the humble spec fire off of the Acontecimento grenade launcher that we mentioned all the way back when we were looking at them. Provided you cover for that, you have a very fast, very durable, very mobile, basically just absolute nightmare troop, and one of the few new additions to Shock Army over the course of N4, and a very welcome and very worthwhile one. Next up, and on the much, much pricier end, we have the Garda de Assalto, where you can viably take either the multi-rifle or the Spitfire piece, depending on how many points you have spare. Now, I will be plain about this. The Garda de Assalto is a piece that I do not unilaterally recommend. It is really goddamn expensive for ultimately an Armor 3 BTS 3 2 wound model. However, if you can scrounge up the points to fit one of these into your list, you get a ballistic skill 15 infantry packing very serviceable weapons. That Spitfire with ballistic skill 15 is absolutely going to connect, and you get possibly one of the coolest auxiliaries in the game in the form of the Oxbot, not with flamethrower, but with light shotgun and Eclipse grenade launcher. When people say Panacea has no smoke except, this is the except. Now it is only ballistic skill 10. It is going to do you an absolute mischief trying to land this, but this is it. This is the Panacheanian smoke, and glory be, it is Eclipse smoke, which if you need to block a lane to take a movement, Eclipse is how you do it, except no substitutes. It is just like ignore all of the, oh, but I want to smoke shoot. No, you want to block lanes. Smoke is a visibility control tool, and Eclipse is the visibility control tool. That light shotgun on the Oxbot is also an absolute banger, because it means the damn thing can take face-to-face rolls by itself and accomplish them serviceably, or place down not one but two templates. If that Oxbot appeared on literally any other profile in the entire game that was takeable in numbers, I would take the damn thing in massive numbers, because the only peripheral in basically the entire game that competes with the Oxbot both in power and style points is the Chuxa peripherals in Toha, which have the classic heavy flamethrower but also have a pistol and mimetism. For my druthers, I would say the Oxbot is probably the best peripheral for cost in the entire game. It's just that it's bolted to a pretty serious luxury, admittedly mobile and dangerous heavy infantry. You do need to work to squeeze these guys into a list, and ultimately you get a model that has just 2 wounds and armor 3, it can absolutely be taken down, but if you can make use of it, if you can support it, the tools are there for this guy to really just be a one-man army. And just on the quiet, if Shock Army ever gets reworked, the Garda de Assalto profile is one that I'll be paying particular attention to, because the potential here is absolutely stellar. This guy I am mentioning partially out of a sense of nostalgia and partially out of a genuine recommendation. It's one of my favorite combo pieces in the game. It's just that at the cost, you have to be very careful about including in lists, very considerate, making sure that your other bases are still covered. Do you have the SWC for the Spitfire? If not, can you accommodate a 40-point multi-rifle? And if the answer to those is yes, you get the Oxbot along for the ride, and that piece is an absolute banger. Next up, we have Scylla, a piece that many people are very eager to remind me exists alongside the combined army E-drone as Evo hackers that actually do something. She shares that category with the E-drone and basically only with the E-drone. And she is a piece that, again, a bit like the Garda de Assalto, not cheap, although certainly more affordable at like 35 points. And with the downside of being a single wound girl, but you get a tremendous amount of utility and power for those 35 points. So what are we getting in total here? Firstly, we are getting one of the weirdest and most interesting hacker profiles that you can see. Starting with option one, we just have the hacking device with Trinity +2 damage, which by itself, that's a banger. That's totally excellent. I will take that. That's a great hacking setup. Or we have the extremely weird option of an Evo hacking device with Trinity +2 damage. Now, Trinity +2 damage is an outstanding profile, outstanding hacking program, very, very good. It starts letting you do things like go to toe with enemy Uber hackers. But having that on an Evo hacker means that the cost of including an Evo hacker is no longer an otherwise kind of dead slot. You can slap her into a list and you're getting her and her Trinity and her Pitcher and her Daverbot Charybdis, which, by the by, repeater, heavy flamethrower moving along with her. I have spoken at length about how having access to hackers that can move their own repeaters around the field is very, very good. She's got a Pitcher and she's got ECM hacker, which means that she can really, again, only single wound. She's not failure tolerant, but she can absolutely hang with the bad boys. She can move in on an enemy hacker, move the Daverbot into zone of control. Then she has a combination of Firewall and ECM hacker and that excellent Trinity program and BTS 6. Said that super freaking confidently, didn't I? BTS 6, which means that she's going to be saving at effective BTS 9 against an enemy Trinity or Oblivion attacks, which is about where you want to be, throwing out massive negative modifiers, her own high damage, etc. This is some really Apex Predator hacking stuff, and she would genuinely be, if she was not only single wound and therefore susceptible to things like getting hit by a chain rifle or a mine, or just losing one face-to-face roll with something like a Trinity model, she would be probably the Apex hacker in the entire damn game. Now, the fact that she's single wound is what limits her, but at 35 points for both her and one of the Daverbots, you can't really complain about what you're getting. You also have the option of paying 40 points for her and a Charybdis FDO, where both of them are regular troopers that can join link teams, except they can't join link teams in Shock Army of Acontecimento, so never do that. In Shock Army, it's all about the Scylla with synchronized Charybdis bot, and frankly, take your pick. If you have a use for that Evo hacker, go absolutely nuts with the Evo hacker. If you don't have a use for the Evo hacker, then a hacking device with Trinity +2 damage on that total setup, provided you keep her safe from random templates or getting hit by combo rifles, she's just an absolutely outstanding info war dominance piece with her own repeater and her own pitches and her own excellent hacking and her own utility, etc. Finally, and kind of just last in this list of basic wildcards I wanted to cover, is just to give a quick nod toward Akali's Sikh Commandos. Now, I don't think these guys are outstanding. The character version, Karpal Singh, is also kind of cool, but again, expensive for what you get. But ultimately, these guys are ballistic skill 13 on a drop troop, and that is actually surprisingly rare. A lot of drop troops are sitting at ballistic skill 11 or ballistic skill 12 to compensate for the fact that they could just show up and arrive anywhere on the table, and it's kind of just a limiting factor on the assumption that a lot of the times these troops will be engaging enemies out of cover. And Akalis are just ballistic skill 13, which means that if they are actually able to land and connect, the things like the combi rifle and Spitfire profiles, and 29 points for a ballistic skill 13 Spitfire, I'm not going to be like super happy about trying to land it on 11s or even 14s, but if you have the Evo hacker from Scylla, you can potentially make use of these. And if not, there is always the parachutist option. Again, very much not an always pick. These are an occasional and sometimes spice. But if we think about a lot of the other troops that we've been looking at in this middleweight category, where we have Dart and Nagas and Knights of Montesa, there's a lot of things that are just in about that 20 to 30 kind of point range, high 20 to 30 point range. And you, if you needed to save some points, you could feasibly cut one of them for something like a cheaper Achilles, or just straight swap them for a full-on 29 point Achilles Spitfire. And I feel like I'm saying Achilles there. Achilles? Must be Achilles. So, not broadly a piece that is setting the world on fire, but something that it is worth remembering it exists and just occasionally introducing into your lists. It's one of those pieces that is worth just kind of having your opponent remember exists so that if you are running, say, a 14 trooper list, which you will occasionally do, you have that option in this faction, you're kind of presenting the illusion of some other threat if you're so inclined to do so. And while we're talking about them, quick note to Karpal Singh, a Callous Sergeant. Generally speaking, you're going to be wanting the NCO version here, which is one of the rare examples of a drop troop that can, like for example, we know that tactical awareness drop troops don't really work. We know that impetuous irregular drop troops don't really work because you don't generate that irregular order, for example, when you're off the field. But Karpal Singh can turn up using his regular order and then spend the lieutenant order using NCO, and he's just really more of the same that you get from Akalis, but with actually, look, we're going to say just barely credible close combat. Martial Arts level 2 and CC21 means that you're rolling on 24s against your opponent most of the time, and if what you're going after is a tag with that EMCCW, that is exactly scary enough to just maybe make your opponent brown their breeches if you are able to use stealth and parachutists to sneak in off of a table edge and maybe get a kill. At 32 points, Singh is starting to displace pieces like Nagas and Dart, and he's more expensive, for example, than most of the Knights of Montesa. But a bit like Achilles, if you wanted to just slap a little bit of spice into your list from time to time, Singh is a piece that can exploit a gap or an opening really kind of effectively. He's also Fizz 12 rather than Fizz 11, which means that if you do have the Evo hacker, he's landing on 15s, which is good. But again, he is a 32-point piece, and if you fail that roll on a 15, you will feel pretty sad. Whereas something like the 29-point Spitfire Acalis, if that fails its roll to land, well, then you have a Ballistic Steel 13 Spitfire in your deployment zone. Whereas if Singh fails the roll, he is spending his NCO orders for a couple of turns, just trying desperately to get forward into a position where he might do something. But in terms of the potential that you can do with a parachutist martial artist with an EMCCW at 32 points with NCO, there are a few pieces in the game that will realistically outperform him, yes, but he is pretty cool, and it's something that you otherwise don't see a ton of in Pan-Oceania, and particularly in the Shock Army. So, just to round things out, we're going to showcase, as we have begun to do in these faction focuses, a sample army to potentially get you started with the Shock Army of Acontecimento. And this one, thanks in particular to Lockie Carter, that's De Border, if you follow him on YouTube or the forums or Discord, who I reached out to and had a bit of a quick chat. And he didn't suggest this list. I have made some changes because his original list included some distinct Lockieisms, like a total and unabashed willingness to just play 14 troopers all the time consistently. I don't hate doing that, particularly if you've established a credible willingness to take drop troops, but 15 troops is generally where you should be aiming for something like a sample starter army. If you can use all those troop slots, it is good to do so. Nevertheless, Lockie, thank you very much for the suggestion. I've adapted it as follows. So in the first combat group, we have our 5-person regular corps. We have a lieutenant and a decoy, a paramedic, the hacker with hacking device and combi rifle, grenade launcher, and fast panda, and then one of our Acontecimento sapper snipers. We then have a 3-person Harris team. In this case, we have the Bagh-Mari HMG for some nice high burst 5, a machinist shock army of Acontecimento, and a bulleteer with heavy shotgun. So kind of as discussed, this little 3-person team can support your mechanized elements, your peacemaker, your tick belang, your bulleteer. Move into the midfield, press some buttons, and then use the bulleteer to force close assault and then recover it with the machinist if it goes down. We then have a Naga killer hacker coming in at 30 points because we do have a couple of repeaters in this list, both the Peacemaker in Group 2 and the Bulleteer, which will be moving forward. And the Naga, again, is just rounding out our specialist choices. We haven't built this list for any particular mission, so we're trying to kind of be able to do all missions, and the Naga is part of that. Alongside the regular hacker, this gives you both a hacker and a killer hacker, both of which are either whip 13 or 14, which gives you some options in the info war space. Just a splash, but some options in the info war space. We then have a war core because we're looking to have this list hit 15 troops, and we're going to make some sacrifices when it comes to irregular pieces. But you can afford to take some irregulars in a list like Shock Army. There is nothing wrong with a war correspondent, particularly if it gets you up to that 15 trooper limit. Although do bear in mind that your command tokens can be constrained, particularly if you're rerolling Whip 12 engineer rolls on the reg. Then in Combat Group 2, we have a Tikbalang. Again, it's a Pan-Oceanian list, it's a Shock Army list, and the Tikbalang is one of the best tags in the game. We were going to take either it or the Dragao, and I've gone with the Tikbalang in this case just because it is a little bit cheaper and it's allowed me to afford some other things. But if you were willing, just a simple change that you could make if you wanted the Dragao is to cut the Tekbi out of this combat group, and then you just have the points for the Tikbalang. We then have a Knight of Montesa. This is the cheapest version of the Knight of Montesa at just 27 points. It is purely for close assault. We are relying on our Combat Group 1 pieces for specialists, or the Crabot in the Tikbalang, or the Tekbi in this combat group. If you found that you were able to free up points, for example, if you think you didn't need the killer hacker on the Naga, you could turn it into a mine layer, and that should give you the points, for example, to turn the Knight of Montesa into a paramedic, just is a flex that you could make. But in this case, this Knight is purely for close assault, and early in the game, or even just throughout the game, you can duo it with the Tikbalang for some order efficiency, being able to use the Tikbalang. The orders the Tikbalang spends can be used to use the Knight up at the same time. We then have just one Fugazi Dronbot. Again, if we had some more points, we might turn some of our regulars into Fugazis, but some sacrifices are to be made to fit everything in. We have a Peacemaker. I like Peacemakers. We have two hackers in this list, so it's a midfield repeater is good. It's a little bit more because we've taken one of the sacrifices we've made in this list is we have no deployment zone mine layers, which is something you would otherwise find yourself able to take a fair few of in Acontecimento. You could consider cutting this Peacemaker for things like maybe you cut the Peacemaker and the Warcore for a couple of mine layer regulars. That would give you both some close defense with the mines as well as a few points to spare to free up and upgrade other things. But in this case, I like Peacemakers. Even at 24 points, I do still like them, although they're a little bit pricey at that point, and I wanted to get one into the list. Finally, we have a Tech B. A Tech B in Combat Group 2 alongside a piece like a tag is just a combination that I have liked in a lot of Pan-Oceanian lists. What it means is that if the Tikbalang is not in a position basically where it has suppressed all of the AROs that it needs to, and it doesn't want to aggressively move forward, and you have that irregular order spare, over the course of the game, you can just slowly move the Tech B forward until she is in a position to start doing objectives if you find you need to. Now, with the mobility of the Tikbalang and the Knight of Montesa, it's going to be rare that this combat group actually doesn't have a productive way to spend its orders. So, for example, if that Naga Killer Hacker was to get turned into a mine layer, which would save 2 points, I would very strongly consider turning the Tech B into a Fugazi, and just rely exclusively on Combat Group 1 for doing mission stuff, and really just leave Combat Group 2 with the maximum number of regular orders and aggressive elements to put the pedal to the metal over the course of the entire game. Otherwise, though, I think this list does an excellent job of really covering a huge variety of the bases that Shock Army can cover. It has good independent elements, it has midfield, it has a tag, it has a nice powerful core link with a big gun and the grenade launcher in it. It's doing basically everything I can ask, and it even fits in a duo and a Haris team, both of which are very capable. Now, do bear in mind that one of the things I said at the very beginning is that Shock Army, it's a Pan-Oceanian faction. It does not necessarily need to tailor for the table or the opponent. It will have big guns. It will have the capacity to play most tables. Therefore, it's going to need/want to tailor for the mission. If you are playing this, you should think about the missions that you are going to be playing with it and adjust it accordingly. In this case, we've got hacking and engineers and paramedics, but they aren't all necessarily in the places that you might always want them to be to do all of the missions you might be doing. So think about, for example, does that Knight of Montesa need to be a peacemaker because I'm playing supplies? Do I want maybe more access to hackers, and can I make some sacrifices to fit a second Naga hacker in there because the mission is very hacking forward in terms of the specialist bonuses? Or do I not need to do many specialist bonus things at all, and I can afford to just fight Annihilation, in which case we can step back off some of the specialists and do other things instead? Do I need to do a bunch of classifieds? Do I need classified redundancy? Like, etc., 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 right? Think about the mission that you're going to play, and if you start with this as a template, you make adjustments accordingly. And of course, according to your personal taste. There are plenty of things that you could look at and explore inside Shock Army of Acontecimento, things that you could tinker and tweak with. Do you want the Tikbalang to be a Dragao? That kind of stuff. Mix it up to your personal preference, but with this as a starting point, you should do fairly well. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. I have a bunch of both battle reports and faction focuses that I'm looking to do at some point in future, all of them in response to either channel support or channel member requests. Very much value all of you guys and thank you very much. As always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.